Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, January 3rd, 2023. All right, so the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, Zelensky expands his crackdown on news media. So this is from Kyle Anzalone over at the Libertarian Institute. Zelensky signed a new bill into law that boosts Kiev's control over the public's access to news in Ukraine. Zelensky has already used his martial law powers to nationalize Ukraine's media. So, according to the New York Times, this law expands Kiev's control over news outlets to print and online sources. And back in March, he nationalized broadcast media in part of his effort to quash dissent. So the Kiev Independent explains that the law will allow a governmental body to give licenses to outlets, and any media organization without the proper paperwork can be shut down. The Kiev Independent noted that the body handing out the permits will be under total control of Zelensky. So, this is from the Kiev Independent article. According to Ukraine's Institute of Mass Information, under the law, the media regulator is likely to be controlled by the incumbent authorities because its members are appointed by Zelensky and the Ukrainian parliament, where his party has an absolute majority. Um, and earlier in the war, also in March, that's when he nationalized the media. He also banned 11 opposition parties, including the largest opposition party in Ukraine's parliament. So his party is very much in control of the parliament, and that's who's going to be in charge of this new media policy. So this really is important because we have to. You see all the information that's coming out of Ukraine. It's tough to really know what's going on, and that's the case for any war. What's really happening on the ground. But when you see that Zelensky is taking these steps to really control the media, that we're kind of being fed a select narrative, and of course that goes just with the Western media coverage of this war, the way that they're covering it. But with this, it seems like they're really going to be trying to control the message that's coming out of Ukraine. And the New York Times, they covered calls from human rights groups that are speaking out against this law. The Committee to Protect the Journalists and the European Federation of Journalists slammed the legislation while it was being debated. Subsequently, Ukraine's legislature stripped away some of the bill's more extreme measures. However, the law Zelensky signed will still give Kiev near total control over Ukraine's news media. All right, the next article here. So Ukraine wants the EU to get rid of exemptions that it has for medicine for its sanctions on Russia. And Ukraine is threatening to punish European pharmaceutical companies that are still operating inside Russia. This was according to a report from Politico. So the EU has imposed wide-ranging sanctions on Russia, but they've exempted medicines due to humanitarian concerns. This report said that the exemption has not sat well with Ukraine as Kiev wants Russia under a total embargo. They don't care if that deprives Russians of medicine. The Ukrainian government, they've already taken some steps to punish European pharmaceutical companies over their business in Russia by granting itself the power to ban medicines from the Ukrainian market. So they did this by changing the law back in May. So now the government can, ban these products. And the idea is to ban the sale of any goods produced by pharmaceutical companies that haven't left Russia. So far, Ukraine has taken action against one company, Gedeon Richter, which is based in Hungary. And in October, Ukraine's health ministry said that 35 medicines produced by this company were temporarily banned. They said this in a statement, although the Politico report said that the products haven't been officially pulled from the market. They're still holding out doing that. And responding to the move, this Hungarian company said that it was incomprehensible and they warned that it endangered the supply of medicine to the Ukrainian people. Now, Ukrainian officials insist that they have enough alternatives on the market so Ukrainians won't have to go without medicine. But I just think you can't be helping yourself if you're banning medicines, while the country's being destroyed. It's a war torn country. Just doesn't seem like a good idea. And of course, the EU, Brussels is not happy with Ukraine's position, and they fear that Ukraine is trying to weaponize medicine while also hurting European business interests. According to a document obtained by Politico, Ukraine has named a total of 19 companies that it could target, the majority of which are based in the EU. So sanctions imposed by the US and its allies, they typically have exemptions for medicine and food. But just because of the nature of sanctions, they still cause shortages of these goods because they discourage companies from doing business with countries altogether. For example, sanctions on Iran are said to have, they say they have exemptions for humanitarian goods, but they still cause medicine shortages and increased food insecurity inside the country. Ukraine's deputy economy minister acknowledged in comments to Politico that there is a moral question about sanctioning medicine, but still called for a full embargo on Russia. So this official said, quote, "There is a big debate about to what extent it is moral for pharmaceutical companies to withdraw from Russia because it's a matter of life and death. For us, it is as well a matter of life and death, and we advocate for the fullest possible embargo on Russian products and economic activity in Russia," end quote. So basically saying, acknowledging that depriving Russians of some medicines could mean death, acknowledging that that doesn't matter. They still want the full embargo. And this reflects, the Ukrainian government's attitude. Zelensky has previously called for the collective punishment of Russians over this war, which was launched by Putin. Back when he demanded Western countries to ban all Russian travelers, Zelensky said that the whole population of Russia was at fault for the invasion. So, where this issue stands now with this medicine, Ukrainian officials are downplaying the idea that Kiev and Brussels are at odds over this issue, but the Politico report says that it's very much still outstanding and it's not resolved. So, we'll see how this plays out. The next article here, a Ukrainian HIMARS strike kills dozens of Russian soldiers in the Donbass. So the Russian Defense Ministry said Monday that 63 Russian soldiers were killed in a Ukrainian rocket strike in the eastern Donetsk Oblast, in one of the deadliest Ukrainian strikes against Russian troops of the war. So according to the Russian Defense Ministry, Ukraine used the U.S. provided HIMARS rocket launch systems in the attack. And, it goes to show what the U.S. is enabling Ukraine to do. Some pretty serious destruction against Russian forces. And, you always have to wonder, because we know that the U.S. is giving Ukraine targeting intelligence if they use that to carry out this strike. And according to Russian media, the strike hit a temporary housing facility used by Russian forces in the Donbass. So the Russian Defense Ministry, they didn't say exactly when the strike took place, but Ukraine's armed forces, they said that they struck a vocational school building that was housing Russian troops in the same area on Sunday. And they claim that the strike killed 400 Russian soldiers, which is a huge number and a lot higher than what Russia has confirmed. So we don't know exactly what the death toll is. Russia says 63. Ukraine says 400. It's a huge difference. I would lean more toward the Russian side, but it's possible that the casualty rate could be higher. We don't know for sure. But yeah, it's a pretty significant. It's the highest number I've seen in a single Ukrainian strike against Russia, and that's the 63 that's been confirmed by Russia. So again, they're using these U.S. provided weapons to do this, and possibly intelligence. It really goes to show how involved the U.S. is in this war. Okay, so the next one, this is from our friend Brett Wilkins, who writes over at Common Dreams and lets us reprint his stuff at antiwar.com. Used to write for us pretty regularly. Israel's Ben-Gvir postpones his visit to al-Aqsa amid warnings that people will die. So Israel's far-right national security minister on Monday postponed a planned visit to Islam's third holiest site amid warnings from the country's opposition leader and Palestinian officials that such a trip would have deadly consequences. The Times of Israel reports Minister of National Security Itamar Ben-Gvir, and so he's new in this new Netanyahu government. I mean, he's very extreme, sympathetic. He's praised, terrorists before that have killed innocent Palestinians. Very, very extreme. And he's got a pretty serious post in Netanyahu's government so he has some power now. But the Times of Israel reported that he put off a promised visit to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And that's the compound in Jerusalem, which sits on what the Jews call the Temple Mount, Judaism's most sacred site since biblical times. So he postponed this visit after speaking with Netanyahu because, this is such a sensitive area, and Israeli forces a lot of times and settlers storm this Al-Aqsa Mosque, and it could spark fighting and more violence with the Palestinians. So Ben-Gvir, he promised to visit the site, but it looks like he's backed down a little bit. And Yair Lapid, the former Israeli prime minister who just stepped down last week as Netanyahu took over, who is now the leader of the opposition, he said on Monday that Ben-Gvir must not go up to the Temple Mount because it's a deliberate provocation that will put lives in danger. He's saying people will die if he goes there. I mean, so that shows how sensitive this is. This is Lapid saying, it's going to lead to unnecessary violence. So he's still saying, Ben-Gvir, he's the leader of the Atzma Yehudit party, which translates to Jewish power. He declared that no one's going to threaten us or tell us anything. So he's basically saying, I'm going to go there, at some point, and they can't stop me. But at least he's backing down for now. And Hamas said that the Palestinian resistance is not going to sit back and just let this happen. They won't sit idly by. So who knows if he does go, they might fire some rockets, and that could spark another, Israeli bombing campaign of Gaza. Back in 2021, that's what sparked it. Israeli forces stormed and tear gassed Palestinians in Al-Aqsa, multiple times. And then some rockets were fired out of Gaza, and then Israel really bombed heavy bombardment of Gaza. And that was in spring 2021. It killed a few hundred Palestinians, including about 60 children. So that's what, this could spark if he goes through with this. But I think we're going to see a lot more violence just with this new government. I mean, they're going to keep being provocative. And it's just not a good situation. And that bombing campaign in Gaza in spring 2021, that led the U.S. to giving Israel an extra $1 billion in military aid for that year, on top of the $3.8 billion that they give Israel. Actually, I think they gave it to them in 2022. But that's what happens. They bomb Gaza. They say, "Oh, we used up all of our Iron Dome air defense systems. We need to replenish it," and they get another $1 billion in military aid. All right, the next article here: the U.S. sends fighter jets to Israeli airbase for a temporary deployment. So the U.S. has sent 6 F-15 fighter jets to an Israeli airbase for a deployment that will involve joint drills with the Israeli Air Force as the two countries continue to step up military cooperation. So these F-15s are being sent to a airbase in southern Israel, and it's part of a program that they deploy U.S. aircraft to allied bases instead of U.S. overseas bases. And they kind of switch it up. So this will be temporary. They're going to send them there for a little, and then, sometimes they'll send them to another base. But according to the Times of Israel, the Israeli Air Force said that the F-15s will participate in exercises with Israel's fleet of F-35s this week, and they're going to simulate strikes deep inside enemy territory, is how they put it. And that suggests that these are going to be more drills simulating attacks on Iran, which they did that back in November over the Mediterranean Sea. And this comes as, the US used to kind of avoid, blatantly practicing bombing Iran with Israel. But now that tensions keep growing, the US is increasing sanctions on Iran, supporting the protesters. They're kind of becoming more provocative with these drills with Israel. And just in general, the US and Israel have agreed to step up military cooperation. So we're probably going to see more stuff like this, more joint drills that are aimed at Iran, especially again with this new government. Netanyahu was a huge Iran hawk. So it's just going to keep tensions are going to keep spiraling there. All right, the next one, Maduro, the Venezuelan president, he says that he's ready to work toward normalization with the U.S. So he said this on Sunday, and this comes after the opposition dissolved the U.S.-backed interim government and removed Juan Guaido as the interim president, who the U.S. recognized as president in part of this failed regime change effort against Maduro. They recognized Guaido, they backed the failed coup attempt all out in the open, blatantly, and put the country under crushing sanctions. Years later, it looks like there's a possible rapprochement happening here, and Maduro says that he's ready for it. So he said, quote, Venezuela is ready, totally ready to take steps toward a process of normalization of diplomatic, consular, and political relations with the current administration of the United States and with administrations to come, end quote. So we'll see if more plays out here, because right now, so far, the U.S. has lifted sanctions. I shouldn't even say lifted sanctions. They've eased them very minimally by giving Chevron a license to restart pumping oil in Venezuela, but still, like the real harsh sanctions are still in effect, which have had a pretty devastating impact on Venezuela's civilian population. So we'll see. Hopefully, this is a sign that there will be more to come of this, and that Biden will actually reverse this policy, these sanctions that were imposed by Trump. But I mean, I don't have any big expectations of Biden to do something like that. But hopefully, I don't know. Maduro sounds like he's ready to do it. All right, the next one here: the U.S. and South Korea are in talks over holding joint nuclear exercises. And this is according to South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol. He said that he's in talks with the U.S. on holding joint exercises with U.S. nuclear forces. And this is a move that would significantly raise tensions on the Korean Peninsula. And he said this a day after Kim Jong-un called for an exponential increase in Pyongyang's nuclear arsenal. So again, tit for tat, things just keep rising here. And Yoon said that being under the U.S. nuclear umbrella is not enough, and he wants South Korea's military to be involved in planning with U.S. nuclear forces. And he said that he received positive feedback from the U.S. about the idea, what he's calling extended nuclear deterrence. But President Biden appeared to contradict Yoon's comments on Monday after these comments from Yoon were published in South Korean media. President Biden arrived in D.C. back from his vacation to the Virgin Islands, and he was asked by a reporter if the U.S. was in discussions with South Korea on holding joint nuclear exercises, and he simply replied, no. But, I mean, he might not even know about these discussions. Who knows? It wasn't like he didn't give much of an answer. He just said no, and that was that. So Yoon's office responded, South Korea responded to Biden's answer and insisted that these discussions were, in fact, taking place. And a spokeswoman for Yoon said that, Biden had to say no because he was asked if it was joint nuclear exercises, which insinuates that I don't know, that that means that's a term used for exercises between two nuclear powers, and that's not what South Korea doesn't have their own nukes. I don't know. Just a technicality that they're trying to explain Biden's comments. I think he might just have not known what they're talking about. because under this proposal, Yoon said that the nuclear weapons would still belong to the US, but the planning, information sharing, exercises, and training would be carried out jointly. So the US stations nuclear weapons inside European countries under NATO's nuclear sharing program, but Yoon said that the US was uncomfortable with the term nuclear sharing when it came to uh, South Korea. But he's saying that this joint planning that he wants would effectively be just as good as nuclear sharing, have the same effect. But I don't know if he's necessarily asking for the U.S. to store nuclear weapons inside South Korea. So Yoon, he came in May 2022. He was sworn in, and he said that he would take a more hardline approach to the North than his predecessor Moon Jae-in, who was a proponent of Korean reunification. And since Yoon came into office, the US and South Korea have resumed massive war games, and North Korea has really stepped up its weapons tests, launching a record number of missile tests in 2022. So again, tensions just keep soaring on the Korean Peninsula, and there's not really an end in sight. Okay, so the next one here. Speaking of tensions, Chinese military flights around Taiwan nearly doubled in 2022. So Chinese flights in Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, which is known as an ADIZ, they nearly doubled in 2022 as Beijing stepped up its military activity in the region. This is a very important point. They did this in response to the U.S. forging stronger ties with Taipei. So an ADIZ, just to clarify, because there's a lot of false headlines about this stuff that we see in the Western media, an ADIZ is not a country's airspace. It's an area where a country requires an aircraft to identify itself, and Taiwan claims an ADIZ far beyond its airspace. And the U.S. established an ADIZ for Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea in the 1950s, and China claimed one that extends far into the East China Sea back in 2013. So if you're watching the video, you can see the map here. Taiwan claims an ADIZ that extends over mainland China, but they don't report those flights, obviously. They report the ones that are usually east of the median line that separates the Taiwan Strait, and in the southwestern area of their ADIZ, which in some cases, these Chinese military flights are closer to mainland China. But it still does represent an uptick in Chinese military activity in the region. So according to numbers compiled by a US-based researcher that were reported by Newsweek, China sent 1,737 planes into Taiwan's ADIZ in 2022, up from 972 flights in 2021. So almost double. And then in 2020, Taiwan's defense ministry reported 380 Chinese flights in the ADIZ. That's a lot less. So Taiwan's defense ministry began publicly reporting these Chinese flights in this region, in the ADIZ, in September 2020. And that came after the U.S. sent high-ranking cabinet officials to Taiwan for the first time since 1979. That's when Washington severed diplomatic ties with Taipei. Trump sent his health secretary, and then, like, I forget the other one, his undersecretary for economic affairs or something like that. But that's when this all really started. And then Chinese military activity around Taiwan spiked in 2022 after Nancy Pelosi, who's the outgoing House Speaker, she visited the island in August, and China launched its largest ever military exercises. So again, this has a direct correlation with U.S. support for Taiwan, and these symbolic visits that might not seem that significant to people that don't understand this issue, but to China, this is everything. To U.S.-China relations, this is everything. And a consequence of Pelosi's visit is that China now regularly crosses the median line, which is another thing that was established by the U.S. in the 1950s. It was an unofficial barrier that separates the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. China used to never cross it, but now, according to these numbers, they crossed it 564 times in 2022. And only one of those was before Pelosi visited. So 563 times after she visited. I mean, those numbers show what her visit did. And according to numbers compiled by Japan Times, China only flew across the median line 4 times between 1954 and August 2020. So 4 times in all those decades, and then 563 times after Pelosi visited Taiwan. It's significant. And China recently launched new major drills around Taiwan in response to President Biden signing the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, which includes unprecedented military aid for the island. So, again, the important point here: more U.S. support, more U.S. visits, official visits. We're going to see more Chinese military activity around Taiwan. All right, the last article in the news section here. This is from Middle East Eye, and this is about the recent high-level meeting between Turkey and Syria. Their defense ministers held talks for the first time in 11 years, and there were some reports that said they worked out a deal where Turkey would withdraw troops from Syria. But multiple sources, I believe this is mostly Turkish sources, told Middle East Eye that that's not true. They said the talks were cordial, but no deals have been made. And there were some things that Syria proposed that Turkey rejected. And one of them was designating all the Syrian fighters and stuff that Turkey backs against Assad as terrorists. Turkey doesn't want to do that. And again, Turkey was all in on the regime change effort against Assad, backed some really bad groups. And so this is very significant that they're talking. And I still believe that they're going to continue talking, and it could lead to a normalization of ties eventually. But right now, it doesn't look like any deals were made. According to this report, again, there's other reports that said they agreed to a withdrawal, but I think we're we're a long way from Turkey pulling out of the areas that it controls in northern Syria there. But that's it for the news for today. Go check out our Viewpoints. As always, we have a lot of good ones. One from David Stockman about the first Gulf War, a catastrophic error. He's a really good writer, and his foreign policy stuff we get to reprint. So definitely go read that. William J. Astor writing about AI and how it is suspicious of the military-industrial complex. One from Pat Elder about the fate of the USS Bonhomme Richard. Let's see. Bradley Devon about BlackRock's plot to buy Ukraine. That's over at the American Conservative. And Tim Shorrock writing over at his website about Japan crossing the Rubicon. And this is about Japan announcing its doubling its military budget and going to acquire missiles that could strike potentially China and North Korea. The most significant expansion of its military since the end of World War II. So go check all that out. We have good stuff in the blog, tons of stuff at the bottom of the page as well. Ton of content at antiwar.com. Just because you listen or watch this show doesn't mean that you've digested it all, but the important stuff you have at least. But that's it for me for today. Antiwar.com/donate to support the show. Like and subscribe on YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble. Share the show with your friends. If you listen to the audio on podcasts, you could leave a review. Again, sharing around is another great way to support us. But that's it for me for today. I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.